In last week's story, Queen Vashti said no to her husband's humiliating demand that she parade in front of a bunch of men who've been drinking for 7 days, only wearing her crown. After years of suffering under this boorish fool, she finally had enough and refused. But the men who surrounded the king convinced him he had to do something, or all the women of the kingdom would follow suit and refuse to follow their husband's demands too. So Vashti was banished. And to replace her, they held a kingdom-wide beauty contest where all the most beautiful women from India to Ethiopia were brought to the capital city. And before seeing the king, they had beauty treatments, 6 months with oils and another 6 months with creams. And it's actually one of my favorite details in the story. And the most beautiful of them all was a young woman named Hadassah. Now, you may know her by her Persian name, Esther. You see, they lived in this multi-ethnic kingdom, and her family had been among the Jews forced into Babylonian exile who decided to stay behind. They remained where they had built new lives instead of moved back to Jerusalem to rebuild there. And it seems like they were relatively well integrated, but like any minority, you don't really want to test the bounds of acceptance. And so when Esther became the queen, Mordecai advised her not to reveal her Jewish identity to the king, because there was no need to draw unwanted attention. And they didn't reveal their relationship either. Mordecai was her older cousin, and some say uncle, who took her in after her parents died, and he raised her as one of his own. So sometime after Esther was made queen, there was a man named Haman, or Haman, who was elevated to a position of honor in the court, and it went straight to his head. He was not a nice man. He was a narcissistic jerk. Among other things, he ordered anyone who passed by him to stop and kneel. And Mordecai either thought this was ridiculous or refused to bow before anyone except God. So when Haman walked by, Mordecai just stood there minding his own business. He was whistling and looking for dirt under his fingernails, pretending he didn't see Haman, who was incensed. How dare he disrespect me? And he looked for a way to get back at him. But not just Mordecai. Let's make this really hurt. And he devised a plan to kill all Jews. And he went to the king and with an ominous tone warned him that there's a certain dangerous element living among them. They don't follow our laws and customs, and they're plotting. They're coming for you. And he insisted the evidence is clear. Haman stoked his fears and manipulated the easily manipulated king into signing an order that they should all be killed before they do something to the king. And even better, Haman promised to pay for the whole thing. Now, mind you, this was because Mordecai refused to make Haman feel like a big man. So Haman went home. He placed a big wooden pole, 75 feet high, right outside the palace, and sharpened the top like a pencil so he could impale Mordecai on it. I mean, what a gruesome scene. What a gruesome idea. And Mordecai overheard this plot. And he sent news to Esther explaining the danger to all Jews and said, "Don't think because you're queen you'll be spared." And then he famously told her, "Perhaps you were made queen for just such a time as this." But protocol didn't allow the queen to simply go to the king to plead for their lives, to intervene, because she could be killed for doing it, for being so impertinent. And so here's what she did. She put on some of that perfume she'd bathed in for 6 months. She dressed up in all her royal finery, and then she just stood around the entrance to the throne room looking like she was minding her own business. And she waited to see if the king would notice her. And he did, and he called her over, which is what had to happen. He had to call her over, and he said, "What can I do for you? Just ask, I'll give you even half of my kingdom." She said, "If it pleases you, come today for a feast that I have prepared. And invite Haman too." And that evening, they all had such a pleasant time that the king asked again, "What can I do for you? Anything. I'll give you even half of my kingdom." "Well, if it pleases the king, and if the king wants to grant my wish and my desire, I'd like the king to come to another feast tomorrow night. And then I'll give you my answer. Oh, and bring Haman too." Now, Haman beamed. The next day he strutted around, and his head was the size of a hot air balloon. But his balloon deflated when on his way home he saw Mordecai, who once again, instead of getting up, just sat on the ground and paid him no attention. And Haman just boiled with rage, but he decided, I'll deal with him later, because nothing is going to ruin my special night. And after another wonderful dinner, the king asked again, "What can I do for you?" "Half of my kingdom, if that's what you'd wish." And Esther replied, "If I please the king, and if the king wishes, grant me my life." That's my wish. "And the lives of my people too." "What do you mean?" And she explained that someone wants to kill her and all her people. And then she added, but actually, you're the real victim of this plot. I mean, these are your people, and no enemy can compensate you for the terrible damage done to you. Isn't that a brilliant move? In fact, she added, I wouldn't have even bothered you if we were simply being sold into slavery. And the king asked, who would do such an evil thing? Conveniently, sitting right there across the table, Haman's face grew red and he tried to play it cool. And then, thanks to Esther's well-played scheme, she pointed, that wicked Haman. And the king was incensed. He stormed out of the room, and Haman got down on the ground in front of her to plead with Esther to spare his life. And then, just then, the king came into the room, and he looked like Haman was on the ground trying to assault his wife. And the king said, in my own house? And one of the king's eunuchs quickly pointed, look, sir, over there, it's a pole 75 feet high that Haman made to impale Mordecai. The eunuch, like many others, probably loathed Haman. He added, Mordecai, the guy who did you a favor. No, so we have to go back a little bit. Sometime earlier, actually quite a ways back, Mordecai overheard two guards plotting to kill the king. And I just think, did Mordecai have superhero hearing that he could keep overhearing these things? So at the time, he told Esther, who told the grateful king, and the plotters were hanged. But the king didn't return his gratitude into any kind of favor for Mordecai. But recently, the king had been reminded of this deed and made him an official in his court, which made Haman even madder. So again, the eunuch pointed to the pole that Haman had built to kill Mordecai and suggested that the king use Haman's pole as Haman's punishment. And the king commanded, impale him on it. And then he gave all of Haman's wealth and his highest position in the court to Mordecai. So you can see a complete reversal of fortune. However, always a however, that order to annihilate the Jews remained in effect. And so what would happen now? And that's how the story concludes next week. So Vashti took a risk, right? And she said no, knowing the potential cost and consequences of her decision. And this week, Esther said yes, knowing the potential cost and consequences of her decision. You see, at just the right time, she risked going to the king and disclosing that she had a different identity than what he or anyone else might have thought. And it was one that she had intended to keep secret. But now she discerned her action would save others' lives. And that would be worth the risk. So a few years ago, Andrea and her mother told NPR's StoryCorps about when she began to experience her first symptoms of mental illness. Paranoid thoughts, delusions, and erratic behavior. And they told stories of her rapidly escalating illness and all the tragedy before Andrea was eventually hospitalized. And for 2 weeks, she refused to take any medication until she received a phone call from her grandfather. Andrea, I want you to know that I have been there. He didn't tell her to take medicine. He just said that I've been there too. It was something he had never talked about with anyone, never intended to. A year before Andrea's mother was born, he was institutionalized, and no one knew it, and it would stay that way. And he went on to earn his PhD in chemistry and was a professor for 40 years. But when his granddaughter refused for 2 weeks to cooperate with her treatment, he decided this was just such a time. And he revealed his closely held secret. And Andrea said that changed everything. I thought if he could do it, I could do it too. And she did. And it brought all kinds of healing opportunities to the whole family that would have been ignored had he not shared what had happened to him. So I like the story of Vashti and Esther for this interplay of discernment, when to say no or now, or when to say not yet. And I think of how some people who are like undocumented, who are presented with this kind of dilemma. For example, dreamers who have bravely come forward when some draconian action was about to be taken and risked saying, this is me. This is us. Or coming out stories for people who are LGBTQ. Should I now? Shouldn't I? Or women and men never wishing to speak about it, who've stepped forward to say, me too, in order to help someone, because it was just such a time. When Reverend Amy Butler was pastor of one of the most prominent churches in the country, Riverside Church in New York City, it's a UCC American Baptist congregation, she shared publicly a story she had no intention of ever telling anyone outside of friends and family. At a routine appointment during her second pregnancy, she said the doctor looked and looked at the sonogram images. She was silent for far too long and then told me she'd be right back. The moments that followed were filled with one doctor after another coming into the room, looking at the sonogram screen and then going out to whisper in the hallway. And I kept asking what was going on, but nobody would tell me anything. And my husband was at work, and so I sat in the cold company of beeping monitors, and I felt so afraid. And then all the doctors came into the room together. They stood around me and told me my baby would die at birth, or after a very short, excruciatingly painful few minutes of life, and that continuing the pregnancy to full term would be very dangerous for me. Reverend Butler related that in that room at that moment, it never occurred to me that my husband and I wouldn't be allowed to make a medical decision. But then came a moment, just such a time as this, when it was more important to take the risk of publicly telling the media and her church their very personal story, not for any recognition, but because it could save someone's life. To me, Esther is one of the most inspirational stories in the Bible. It's about all this risk-taking and this discernment and these decisions about personal sacrifice. In particular, Esther used her position of privilege, which ultimately could not save her. She used her position of privilege to save others' lives. And there are times we have these decisions to make too. And perhaps there's a conversation you've never wanted to have, or a decision you've been putting off. For someone here today, waiting for the courage of Esther, maybe this is just such a time.